Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled How Cerner Enviza Uses Clinical Data to Drive RWE Decisions. I'm Sydney Menson from the events team here at Scientist.com, and I'm happy to be your host for today's event. This webinar has been sponsored by Cerner Enviza, so a huge thank you to them for helping to make this webinar possible. Joining us today, we have 4 experts from Cerner Enviza participating in today's event. I'll first introduce your moderator, Andy Stankus, General Manager of the Real World Evidence team with over 25 years of healthcare industry experience in global markets. Next up, we have Ryan Moog, Head of Clinical Development of Regulatory and Safety Products, who leads teams focused on evolving Cerner's platform for collaborative research and data science. Our third speaker with us today is Dr. Patricia Medina, General Manager of Medical Intelligence, Real-World Data and Analytics. She's responsible for a team generating real-world evidence with secondary data sources and infuses medical and methodology insights into different study types. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Thompson, Senior Evidence Generation Lead in Real-World Data and Analytics, who manages design, analysis, and interpretation of real-world evidence-based studies involving secondary retrospective data sources. Without further ado, I'd like to bring Andy on. Hi, Andy. Thanks for
joining.
Hello,
Sydney. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no problem. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you, Sydney, for the warm welcome. And we're so pleased today to be connecting with everyone here on the webinar. I will tell you that we have 3 esteemed leaders of the business that are going to be sharing some exciting information today around how Cerner Enviza is using clinical data to drive real-world evidence decisions. I'll share, as Sydney had mentioned, the speakers from left to right here. I'll be moderating today. Ryan's going to take us into some details around data assets that we have, data assets that we should be thinking about, whereas Patricia's going to drill a little bit deeper in terms of how to get the best value out of these assets and considerations that we should be thinking about as we're going into generating evidence to differentiate solutions to ultimately better patient outcomes. And then Jeff's going to take us through some real live examples where we can see how that value is brought forth, again, ultimately improving patients' lives worldwide. So let's get to today. What will we be speaking on? I just mentioned a little bit on the speakers. We're going to first start with who we are to give a little context. Ryan's going to take us through the data assets. Again, Patricia through operationalizing and some case studies. Jeff, when he will also mention future data offerings in terms of how we continue to evolve and what does the future look like. Please continue to ask your questions throughout in the chat box, as Sydney mentioned, and then we'll also have a Q&A section at the end. So without further ado, just real quick, who are we in terms of Cerner Enviza? We're a global research consultancy that's been around for decades, frankly, working with many of you on this webinar today across 4 different continents, making sure that we're globally connected because we know that you are as well, and it's important that we are all thinking about evidence generation to differentiate solutions so that ultimately we are able to improve patients' lives worldwide. You can see our vision here is to unite the innovation ecosystem, starting with provider and having information that we have a depth and breadth of data, linking that data in many different ways to provide insights into the life sciences industry, as well as bringing back to that connected patient care so that we're able to make sure that we are not only providing information, but ultimately improving patients' lives worldwide. And this is throughout the life cycle in terms of from left to right here of development, thinking and understanding how do we bring remarkable clarity to healthcare's most important decisions that need to be made to ultimately improve patients' lives worldwide again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andy. And I'm going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes really giving you all a sense of the foundational data components of the Cerner Enviza offers here. So as we go through here, we're going to talk first about our provider relationships that we use, the network of organizations we've built that share data, that are accessible resources for research as well. Then we'll talk a little bit about the depth of the actual clinical data that we hold today. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about our claims data, specifically closed claims data, and then the ability to link data across both claims as well as other data sources to really unlock the power of longitudinal healthcare data. So first, I want to spend some time just explaining, when we say clinical data, what do we mean? For us at Cerner and Enviza, really what we're focused on is what we call secondary use data or exhaust data from healthcare organizations, enterprise data warehouses. And that's a really critical thing here. We're not just talking about electronic health record data alone, and not even just talking about traditionally Cerner inpatient healthcare data. If we had been having this conversation 10 years ago, we would have been, Cerner's a large electronic health record vendor across the US and globally. We've been in the arena of secondary use of those data nationally here in the US for over 2 decades at this point, but we would have been focused heavily on inpatient data only. Today, what we're talking about is really longitudinal information pulled from data warehouses. So just as you all, as life sciences organizations, as research entities, are really grappling with this idea of patients transit the healthcare system through any number of different venues, our healthcare system clients are in the exact same boat. They also have to be able to manage the longitudinality of patients, and they're also in their own mergers and acquisitions journey. They are constantly partnering with new organizations, growing their own footprint. And so we're not just looking at the EHR data from one facility. We're really partnering with healthcare systems to pull in data from their enterprise data warehouse. And that longitudinal structured information that they use for their own analytics contains all the information that you would typically assess as part of that clinical data arena. So demographics, medication data, order data, resulting information from labs and microbiology results, et cetera. So really the host of information that gets captured about that patient's journey through the health system. It then, of course, gets cleaned, harmonized, normalized across the thousands of different concepts and terminologies that healthcare systems tend to use, and then aggregated into a single national data warehouse that's de-identified and then made available primarily for insights to be delivered directly to you, from our team through our real-world data access of that information. So as far as how do we actually get those data, and we'll talk a little bit more about the granularity of it and the types of data concepts and domains you may be thinking of here. But first, I want to spend a moment talking about who these provider organizations are that are providing access to data. As I mentioned earlier, Cerner itself is a large electronic health record provider across the world, but here in the US, we manage about a third of American healthcare, is how we typically talk about it and tend to think about it. But just because a health system's data are sitting in a data center does not mean that we use those data for the purposes of Cerner and Enviza. Over the last 3 years, we've been building a learning health network of dozens of organizations across the US of all different shapes and sizes of American healthcare who have raised their hand and said they're interested in participating in research opportunities. They're willing to give access to their de-identified, site-anonymized data to support real-world evidence studies. They're doing a lot of their own work on top of the data, which we feature regularly, and find that that provider side partnership here is really interesting and a fruitful way to enhance the quality of data, the use of data. So it's just more eyeballs on that information. And then ultimately, they're also willing to have research opportunities brought back to them in the form of observational research, registries, clinical trials, et cetera. So we're really pleased about how that network has grown up and the true breadth of data it gives us access to. And as far as the size of our clinical data itself today, and these are all data coming through those data warehouses, but originating from clinical systems like EHRs. Today, we're covering over 100 million patients in the US over the life cycle of our data, and then an enormous number of the data are actually encounter-based. So while we're able to link patients across encounters, we're actually seeing deep information about those encounters themselves, where things like a patient's condition or diagnosis are being captured, a medication order or medication reconciliation event are being captured. So really deep granularity about what's happening to that patient within the encounter itself. We're really pleased at the representation of how the data have developed in terms of the partnerships we've built with all those health systems. And so here we have a couple of examples just on traditional measures of representativeness across the data. But in addition to what's just on the slide, I'd also say we're really pleased about the types of organizations we built those partnerships with. So unlike a lot of clinical data sets you might see that are primarily large academic organizations, or maybe there are a handful of integrated delivery networks that seem to be in lots of different data sets. We're really pleased because we're already the EHR vendor for so many of these organizations who are willing to trust us and partner with us in research. And so we have a lot of unique organizations, community hospitals, critical access hospitals, large faith-based organizations, integrated delivery networks, academic organizations, pediatric organizations, really the entire gamut of American healthcare nearly is represented in our data, and so you're really able to see how American healthcare really is delivered across the U.S. And like I said, really have access to a variety of venues of care. You might typically think of our data as inpatient data because Cerner is really well known as a large inpatient EHR vendor, but the reality is the vast majority of our data come from outpatient encounters, from emergency encounters, and while we still have that depth and granularity of what's happening to a patient in an inpatient encounter, really are able to see holistically across the data and across that patient's journey what's happening to them in the healthcare system. In terms of depth and granularity of data, where you can typically think of our data as particularly useful are in structured information, so things like patient demographics, conditions, problems, medications, really deep encounter information that give you granular data down to the time that an event occurred. Order information where you're able to see what lab test was ordered, was it performed, which medications were reconciled, what did the patient record they were still taking. So you're really able to see a deep amount of granular information. And we continue as an organization to bring new processing and curation to the data. We're currently working on natural language processing capabilities, doing things like chart review projects, and then ultimately also, because I can't overstate how important those provider relationships are to us, working directly with them to refine the data, clean the data, and then also be a good steward of their data for them and their patients and handing them back cleaner, useful data for their own research and analytics. I'd be remiss to not also spend a couple of minutes talking about our enterprise claims data as well. So in addition to the clinical data that we partner with provider organizations on, we also have an enterprise claims relationship where we're able to add an additional 150 million patients worth of records of primarily closed claims and pharmacy claims from across the U.S. that we find are highly representative of U.S. healthcare as well. So just a few quick statistics about how we represent those data. We find that, as you would typically expect, claims data have fairly low attrition rates, so you're able to see a lot about that patient journey from even year to year. The data tend to be highly aligned with the ability to highly aligned with what we typically see in American healthcare. So this is from the CDC's National Health Information Survey. So you'll see our enterprise claims data tend to be fairly fixed to what you'll see out in the market as well. And then also in terms of regionality and representation across the US. The last thing I'll spend a couple of minutes on is our ability to link data. So we absolutely, while we have partnered with provider organizations that are able to give us highly longitudinal information, our typical patient and our data tend to have years of clinical data across their life cycle of encounter with the health system. We also recognize the power of highly cleaned, many organizations, as we saw in the survey, are very familiar with claims data as well. And so we want to bring those to bear as linked data assets, so you can actually do a project that covers both claims data as well as that deep clinical data. Today, we partner with a third-party de-identification and encrypted token expert to be able to provide tokens in our data, as well as tokens for other data sets like claims and mortality, and ultimately produce a longitudinal view of that patient's journey without ever having to compromise their de-identified nature in our data. And then in terms of total overlap today, as we think about how many patients are we really see in both that 100 million plus patient EHR data set, as well as that 150 million patient plus closed claims data set, today we have overlap of about 30 million patients across those two data sets. And those are those patients who we're really able to harness the power of linkage across those data sources.
Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you very much for the audience as well about the poll results and how we are going to interact together. I also expect a lot of questions being generated by this presentation, so we are going to be happy to answer them at one point. And here, what I would like to say is Ryan already gave us this overview about how interesting EHR data can be for research, especially for real-world evidence research. And there's really a lot of variables that we can go and explore and so on, but it's not just about having a great data source. There's a team behind all that. There's a strategy behind all that, of course, when we plan a research needs to be taken care of. And most of that, understanding how the EHR data is generated, how the physicians think, how the hospitals are putting this EHR to their physicians, and how the data is collected. I think there's a need to understand what is behind the data in order to appropriately plan the study, but not also to interpret the results that we are going to have. And this is what I wanted to talk to you today. It's not just about the variables, and we can have so many of them in EHR, but rather how we are going to plan and put these studies in place. And this is the great thing of being at Cerner, is that we have this connection with the healthcare providers, and we understand, we follow them up in their daily lives about how to use the EHR, how we can offer certain modules of the EHR that will help us eventually capture data here and there. So there's this understanding that I want to talk about. And the first thing, of course, when someone wants to plan a research with EHR data, the first question is the EHR the good source for me, right? I have so many sources of real-world data, registries, claims data, EHR. And like Ryan said, we can even sometimes link them together to have a broader view of the patient. But is it really what I'm looking for? Is it really what we need to do in this particular study? And this starts with objectives, right? So the first thing we'll need to do when planning a real-world evidence study is to have a clear goal, a clear view of what we're going to do here. And of course, understand as well the population that will be inside this data source, in this case, the EHR. This EHR is representative of the population of the country you're going to explore. And we know that, for example, in the US is a great market for healthcare, but there's a lot of inegalities for healthcare, problems with access to healthcare and so on. And this needs to be taken into consideration. There's different payers and different providers that are players and that will generate the data for us. And for example, in our case, this is multi-payer, and it is also having a large network of providers, most of them integrated delivery networks. So it's easier for us to capture this longitudinal view of the patient across different providers in an integrated delivery network. But sometimes this is not what we have in the EHR in front of us. So we need to cope and to understand this population and plan accordingly to check if this is going to really answer to my study objectives. And also we need to control confounding, because every time we select a population for a specific drug or a specific disease, we may be introducing some bias, and we need to mitigate and work with them accordingly when we put the study plan in place. And this is what is great in EHR. We're going to have sometimes variables that we don't have in claims. Some sort of, for example, information about weight, height, and some sort of ethnicity and other variables that we don't have in claims, that they are great for confounding and bias control, right? So again, we are going to try to leverage all the tools and all the variables we have to make this study the best and the most appropriate for the scientific community to digest and understand and, okay, what is this study bringing to me? And it's still in this idea of like EHR is the good source for me. I have an objective in my exploration. So these are mostly the things you need to pay attention to. So for example, this source of data, which kind of insurers and payers are inside it? Are these insurers, payers, patients, the good ones for me to explore? Are they representative of the population that I want to understand? And of course, especially if you're exploring a drug or a certain disease, you're going to have a mix of providers taking care of this disease or not. And understanding how this population is managed by these different healthcare providers is also very important, because if we are working with an EHR that is not composed by integrated delivery networks, I may lose some events. I may lose some steps of the patient journey that eventually will be important for me to understand what is going on. And also, more in the informatics point of view, I'm going to work with certain variables, how they are populated in my EHR, because some variables are populated for all patients, or virtually all of them, like demographics and so on. All of patients will have at one point a certain diagnosis. The nurses will put SNOMED codes, and a lot of other codes that will be there, and we are sure that they will be there. But sometimes if I'm looking for for lab test results or for certain parameters, I need to understand who is responsible for including this parameter in the EHR, or sometimes this parameter is automatically populated. So for example, if the hospital has a nice intensive care unit, let's say, and if this monitors and blood pressure and electrocardiogram and all those things that are connected sometimes with a patient in an ICU, if they are connected to the EHR, I know that I'm going to have an automatic capture of all those parameters. And if I'm doing a study that is trying to understand what's happening in the hospital with a certain patient or with a certain disease, I'm going to have all that. But on the other hand, sometimes you need to check if this variable is really completed and what are the level of the completeness. And if the patients who have this variable completed, if they have bias versus the ones that doesn't have this variable completed. So again, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of planning behind an EHR study that is not neglectable and is super important to avoid us interpreting the results wrongly. And also, we are going to try to explore as much as we can what we call structured data, right? Because this is coded. This comes in a more like uniform format, easier to explore, etc. But this doesn't happen all the time. And sometimes we are going to dig into physician notes, test results, radiological evaluations. And this needs to be planned in advance because it will require different techniques, different expertises from the team that will be handling this exploration. And most of the times when we are going to work with a condition, sometimes it's a condition that is a rare disease or a subgroup of patients that can eventually be very small, or patients that are using a certain drug. And even before we start the study, we'll need to understand if I have enough patients that are having this eligibility criteria before moving forward with this study. So for some situations, we are going to run a feasibility assessment and check if everything I need is there before spending time, money, and lead to nowhere. So this feasibility assessment will be more complicated or less complicated, depending on the exploration I'm going to conduct, but it's super important to ensure that all the variables we need will be there. I'm going to complete this like checklist of things that we need to think about when we work with the EHR very soon. And this is probably one of the last slides about that. And this is exactly about like what I can do beyond the EHR, because I have a lot of nice variables, but sometimes I need to dig into the unstructured information using or manual extraction of the information or artificial intelligence techniques such as NLP, rule-based explorations. And I can do that in a lot of types of variables or sources, such as physician notes, images, specialized test results, radiology reports, and a lot of other things. And I can also link the EHR with other sources of data. For example, one of the most common examples of linkage with EHR is linking with claims, because EHR will bring to us all these granular clinical variables that we care so much about when we are exploring certain aspects. And we are going to coordinate that and have that together at the patient level with all the healthcare research use and the claims information that is extremely important sometimes for cost evaluation, economic modeling, and other types of things. And besides that, claims will also give this exhaustiveness. So if for some reason the patient is being treated in a healthcare provider that is not sharing data with my EHR, usually claims is going to point me out and inform that this event happened on the top of what I captured in the EHR. And then sometimes what I can do as well is to activate my research network. And this is something that we have inside Cerner and Enviza. We don't have just a network of providers sharing data, but we have some of them that are really engaged and willing to explore and go further, sometimes recruiting patients and asking additional questions to physician and healthcare providers that are part of this network of patients, of providers taking care of the patients that we're exploring at that point. So the collection of PROs, functional scales, and other types of lab test results sometimes is doable and possible. It's just that we need to, again, to explore and come back to the study objectives about that. And this linkage of data will give us a broader panorama of a single patient. It's completely anonymous, but we are going to be able to understand for a group of patients different types of aspects that they have from the reimbursement payer point of view on the claim side, and from the EHR, more clinical variables on the EHR side. We have different sources of data. They can be linked together. They can be explored together. Again, the possibilities on real-world data evidence generation are really varied, and we can really play a lot as researchers and achieve a lot of objectives. Sometimes we need to explore, of course, primary data collection, registries, and other sources, but there's a lot we can do with this type of sources that we're describing here for you. And there are limitations. We need to carefully think about a study and plan, not only thinking about the variables will be there or not, but also thinking longitudinally, right? Because this patient have a journey. This disease is being treated in a context that needs to be understood. So we need to have a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional thinking to really be able to plan a study accordingly and make the best with the data we have. And finally, the team behind that. The team behind the study with EHR must be knowledgeable about the source and be able to advise the client, regardless if it's in the academia or in the CRO like Cerner and Enviza, or as an advisor. We need to be able to be in a position and understand the variables, know the methods to really achieve the objectives that our client is asking for. And there's a lot of profiles required for doing a study like this. This is not a study that just one single person can conduct. A lot of know-hows are needed. And these ones in front of you are just an example of the profiles we use more often in an EHR study. But there's a big team behind that is involved in certain aspects of the study: project managers, scientists, physicians, and also persons that are outside the CRO and the client, such as external advisors, KOLs, experts, disease associations, patient associations, administrators. So again, a real-world evidence study, depending on the purpose, will be including a large variety of profiles. And we need to think smart. And if we do that, we have, I would say, the good ground to build a good exploration and a scientifically robust study to share with the scientific community. So this is mostly what I wanted to say today, and I'm really excited to answer further questions if you have some. At least this is the way we conduct inside Cerner and Enviza, and I'm open to understand as well if you're having questions about that. With a further delay, I'm going to hand over to Jeff, my colleague that will bring this into, I would say, clinical cases and examples of explorations that we have done recently. And I think you're going to be very excited with what Jeff has to tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. The first case study I'm presenting is on analysis performed using structured EHR data to assess the prevalence of obesity in the past 10 years in the United States. And this was a fairly straightforward study if we're thinking about data sources and methods applied. So obesity is a well-known and ever-growing health issue in the US. And as obesity increases, so do the rates of associated comorbidities, such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Furthermore, obesity rates are also known to be associated with multiple sociodemographic characteristics, including gender, age, and race ethnicity. The objective of the study really was to assess the obesity rates over the past 10 years, which is more important today really because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that, it has been noted that the pandemic caused an increase in the already increasing rates of obesity. So as I said, this is a fairly straightforward analysis. We use the Cerner Enviza structured EHR data. The outcomes were assigned using body mass index, or BMI, calculated using the height and weight information on the most recent patient record per observation year. Patients were classified as obese if their BMI was greater than or equal to 30. And then we also looked at the further substratifications of obese class 1, class 2, and class 3. These rates were looked at overall and by year, and they're also stratified by gender, age, race, ethnicity, and region. And what we found from this study is that there was an almost 10% increase in obesity from 2010 to 2021. And the same trend was observed for all classes of obesity, with the highest value seen in 2021, where roughly 22%, 11%, and 9% of individuals were classified as having obesity class 1, class 2, and the worst, obesity class 3. Overall prevalence tended to be higher in females, and the youngest age group also faced the highest obesity increase in prevalence from 2010 to 2021, going from roughly 15% in 2010 to about 37% in 2021. Additionally, the overall prevalence tended to be higher in Black or African American population, and there was a higher difference seen in the most severe, that obesity class 3, compared to the others. So as we see, this analysis, while straightforward, really does highlight the value of the variables available in the EHR data, which is the sociodemographics, the race and ethnicity, as well as really, those patient characteristics, the clinical characteristics of height and weight that enabled us to calculate BMI and assess it over this time period. With these two big groupings of variables, right, the race, ethnicity, and the height and weight not available in claims or some other data sources. But overall, a fairly straightforward analysis. The second case study I would like to present is on a linked analysis, that was really used to answer a client's research question, which was, how do we understand the usage of biosimilars in oncology, and how do they compare to reference products in terms of patient outcomes, healthcare resource utilization, and costs? Now, key for this study is the outcomes that we wanted to assess, which included progression-free survival, overall survival, and then again, treatment patterns, drug-related costs, and healthcare resource utilization. The issue with trying to operationalize this type of study is that not all outcomes of interest are available in a single data set. Additionally, the need for clinical information, cancer subtype, stage grade, the immunophenotyping, to adequately match the biosimilar users to reference product users was really the key part of this study. Because if we couldn't make an apples to apples, at least as best possible comparison between patients on biosimilars and patients that were on the reference products, then whatever assessment we made in terms of long-term outcomes, particularly progression-free survival and overall survival, could call out limitations that, okay, the patients weren't similar. So we really needed that clinical information from the EHR data, and we also needed information from the other data sources. So the additional data considerations, when we went to design and set up the study, were that the clinical information was in the EHR data only. The lab result data that we needed was in the structured EHR data. Cost data is really only available in claims, and HCRU is really best measured using claims data, as well as mortality. So mortality is within the EHR data itself. However, there are limitations where that mortality observation could only be captured if it occurred within that IDN or within that health system. So, the best approach we came about was using multiple different data sources and linking them all together to operationalize all these outcomes. The first and foremost, and I apologize for misspeaking earlier, is the clinical information we needed, the cancer subtype, stage grade, immunophenotyping. A lot of these are only available in the notes fields within the EHR data. So what we really had to do is go and do unstructured EHR data and design our own ECRF and do a manual extraction and manual review of patient charts to really pull out all of these granular details that were so important to the patient matching between the biosimilar cohort and the reference product user cohort. Additionally, drug regimens were something that we really dug in to the unstructured EHR data, because when we think about, R-CHOP, some of these other drug regimens that are common in oncology, in claims data, you can't operationalize that without making assumptions, because you don't have one value that says, yes, they took all 4 of these medications at once. But within the EHR data, it is listed in there in the way we want. So again, unstructured EHR data, we have the clinical information and the drug regimens. Structured EHR data, we then brought that and merged it with the unstructured to really pull in all of those cleaned up variables that are easy to work with, lab results and demographics, including race, ethnicity. Claims data was then linked with this and to pull out treatment patterns, healthcare resource use and costs, and then mortality data. Again, we're using both the mortality information that's in the EHR data because I don't want to ignore data sources that are there. But we're also linking in an outside source of mortality information from Datavant, which I believe captures roughly 85% of all mortality information in the United States. So this study is still ongoing. We're still building and combining all these data sets, really just because of, the time it takes, particularly to extract all of that unstructured EHR data. But, as Ryan and Patricia mentioned earlier, there are things that we're, constantly working on to expand our capabilities with data. And, in the future, we are looking to implement natural language processing, to do NLP on large free text fields within the EHR data to really do that unstructured notes assessment at scale. We're also looking to develop curated data sets. For example, we have a curated COVID-19 data set from the Cerner and Enviza EHR data, as well as additional linkages to siloed data, such as outside sources of lab information, which is always good to make sure we capture all those details, as well as patient-reported outcomes. Future and additional things we're working on is, in the future, we would like to be able to, provide researchers with the ability to do hands-on work with the EHR data sets themselves. At this current time, everything sits within our systems. Our researchers perform all the analyses, but we have heard from our clients that the ask is there, and that is definitely something in development. And additionally, I always want to call out that there are data sources outside of the US that we do have access to. So when you're thinking about your research question and your research needs, Cerner and Enviza can not only help with, those questions within the United States and US related data, but we also have capabilities outside of the United States. Thank you, everybody, and I will turn it back to Andy.
If we aren't getting to your specific questions here, number one, we will make sure that we get back to you within a week or two of specific written text around answers to your questions, as well as we'll be at ISPOR in case you are as well, both in person as well as virtual. Please come join us, have discussions. We're at booth 222. Specifically, you heard Ryan say earlier about the linkage of the data overall, about 30 million folks linked. By the way, we have disease specifics. So if you're interested in disease specifics, we'd love to talk with you. Please come visit us at ISPOR, as well as continued conversation beyond. So now let me welcome back everybody to the stage here, the proverbial stage, and let's go to a question and answer session. I'm going to go to one that I heard, Jeff, you actually just touched on, but I think maybe Patricia, I can turn it over to you. We talked a fair amount about the U.S. Data sources here and the EHR and whatnot. What other countries do we have access to be able to dig into clinical and broader types of data for RWE analysis?
Sure. So thanks for the person making this question. We were very US focused, but just to give you an example, I'm based in Paris. So we certainly are leveraging our EHR data and the great footprint that we have. Cerner is the most important global EHR provider. And there are specific work streams that are ongoing to expand this data footprint on the EHR in other areas that Cerner is present as well. But outside the EHRs, from our parent company, let's say, we also have EHR access in multiple other countries in Europe, and also access to claims data in Europe and Asia Pacific region, and also in Latin America and in the Middle East. So the data footprint is very large. We cover 4 continents. So I'm not going to be expanding too much on that, but just to let you know that we have other countries as well in our portfolio.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. I have another question here, and thank you for reminding me to give credit where credit's due. Aftab from Baxter, thank you for your question. This next question, I think Ryan may go to you. How many hospitals are represented in the inpatient database?
Sure, Andy. So I would actually break down that question a couple of different ways, but because we don't really possess just an inpatient data set, we see that as we're able to differentiate within the data if it's inpatient, outpatient, or a different type of an encounter. But just to give you a sense of the total size of the data from an inpatient perspective, we represent data on about 2,300 overall facilities, and about 46,000 hospital beds are contained within the data. So that's, I know not every inpatient facility is created equal. So the 46,000 hospital beds should be a pretty good indicator of the amount of inpatient volume we have.
No, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that. And I did hear us just a moment ago with Jeff, your conversation around mortality data. So why don't I turn this over to you, Jeff, if this is the appropriate question for you, and then obviously we can have others answer the question as well. Emily from Janssen, so thank you, Emily, for the question. Are the mortality data validated? Jeff, do you want to handle that?
Sure, and Emily, thank you for the question. If we're talking about actually like a validation study, I would need to follow up on that to see if I can provide materials. What I can say is that, our mortality data is sourced from Datavant, and they, have built up from multiple different inputs to make this, like linkable mortality data set. Now, I'm sure there's public information out there, but yes, I believe that it is validated just because of how often it is used. But in terms of having the specific details, we can follow up and get back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, I'm going to turn now back, Ryan. We have Flora asked a question. She's from the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. Her question is twofold, so I'll take my time through this for you. Have duplicate patients been accounted for in the numbers being provided? So that's the first part of the question. And then what proportion of the patient EHR data is the VA population? And I can ask you the second question in a moment if you want to get back to that.
Great question. So, and thanks for the engagement on this. So, I'll answer the duplicate patient question two ways. Number one is we have factored in that there are duplications of patients within a health system. So within a health system, we actually are able to we leverage an enterprise master patient index that we build with them. As you know, patients tend to have multiple MRNs. They could have dozens of financial identifiers. And so we already account for that. And basically, as part of that healthcare organization data warehousing, have already stitched together longitudinal records of each patient and handled for things like deduplication. The one place today where you will potentially see patients twice, we think it's a really small percentage. We estimate it's based on a recent overlap analysis we did, it's probably less than a quarter of a percentile. Our patients who are seen at multiple members of our research network, we will factor that into, and especially now that we tokenize our data, we can account for that in terms of analyses. But just know that there is some, on a rare occasion, a patient will be seen at multiple health systems under a different type of identifier. So that does happen in rare occasions. And then on the VA question, today we actually we don't have any VA data in the data set we're talking about today. Cerner obviously is on a journey of implementing the new electronic health record for both the VA and the Department of Defense. There are going to be different rules around the use of those data. We're continuing to serve the VA in terms of clinical trials and research, but today those data don't become commercially available.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that. I have another question here. Suzanne, thank you so much for being engaging. You have a couple questions. I'm going to highlight one of them right now. Can you obtain patient case data and over a period of 6 months to 5 years? So I don't know if I'll throw this one to Patricia, maybe possibly Ryan as well, and maybe even Jeff. So again, I'll ask the question, can you obtain patient case data over a period of 6 months to 5 years?
Yeah, this is a great question, and like I mentioned in the presentation, this is a longitudinal source of data, right? So we are going to have multiple years of data, and since most of the contributors for our EHR are integrated delivery networks, they tend to refer internally, right? So it's very easy to capture this longitudinal patient journey. And it can be 5 years, it can be 6 months, it can be 1 year, 2 years, etc. What we need to be mindful of is that, of course, there's an attrition rate that is much lower than what we see in claims data, for example. So in the previous exploration, I think Ryan displayed a slide about that. We are going to have approximately 8 years of follow-up for the patients that have a last encounter in the past 12 months, which is very good when we take into consideration the US market. So yes, this is a longitudinal source.
Great, thank you, Patricia. Appreciate that. Okay, so let's go to one last question. I know we have just a minute or two here left, and we're excited about all the engagement. Like I said, we'll get to all the questions in written form following this. We have a question here, Ryan. I think this may be for you. Are there use cases of the Cerner EHR data in rare disease research? And by the way, can it be linked to newborn genetic testing data from state health departments?
Yeah, great question again. And I think I'd really, first and foremost, say the volume of data we have, as well as the nature of many of those data contributors, probably make our data a leader in getting access to rare disease patients. There are a number of rare diseases that we've already evaluated that we continue to actually, we have another part of our business where we're using these data and those provider relationships to actually run clinical trials directly. And we found that our data and provider partnerships tend to have as many rare disease patients that you would tend to expect in an EHR data set, if not more. So I would say yes. We also actually we highlight publications from our provider base, many of whom have use the EHR data for themselves and for their own funded research programs. And you can find that. I'm sure we can circulate a link, but it's on the www.cerner.com website under real world data publications. So you'll see a number of use cases out there in rare disease. And then as far as linkage to genetic testing data, that's not something that we kind of naturally hold on board data. Certainly, if that was reported back to the health system, that in some cases might be structured and available. But what I'd say is we have intentionally tokenized our data to link to other data sets on a per case basis. So while we will naturally use both our administrative claims data partnership as well as our mortality data for many projects, we're certainly open to exploring linkage to other more novel or more rare data sets. That's an open door.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for that, and Rajeshwari from Vertex for that question. Really appreciate it. I think now, with just a moment left, I'm going to close it out. I know there's lots of other questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but again, like I said, we will get to them in written form, as well as please join us at ISPOR at booth 222. Reach out to the speakers directly. We're happy to have further engagement. So let me turn it back to Sydney.
Thank you all for being here and for your insights today. That was really great to hear from you guys. Okay, a big thanks also to the audience here for participating. And last but not least, we'd like to thank the sponsor, Cerner and Enviza. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to having you with us again soon.